Welcome to Stories Cafe, where I, your host, invite you to join today's thrilling mystery. We're alongside Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings at the enigmatic Ebon Court in Brittany, unraveling the secrets of the 7 keys of Ebon Court. Before we dive in, I'd love to hear where in the world you're tuning in from. Share in the comments, pour a fine cognac, sharpen your little gray cells, and brace for a tale of ancient vengeance. The 7 Keys of Ebon Court, Chapter 1, The Summons to Ebonite. Court. It was a dreary October morning in 1932 when a telegram arrived, thrusting my friend Hercule Poirot and me into one of the most baffling cases of our long partnership. I recall the day vividly. I'd been trying to pique Poirot's interest in a newspaper report of a perplexing Kensington burglary when Miss Lemon, his ever-efficient secretary, knocked and presented a yellow envelope. "An urgent telegram for you, Mr. Poirot," she declared with her usual precision. Poirot's eyebrows arched in that familiar way as he opened the envelope with a paper knife, his gesture as deliberate as a dance. His sharp green eyes, which never missed a detail, scanned the message twice before he handed it to me without a word. The telegram was concise, yet intriguing. "Require immediate assistance. Stop mysterious. Death at Ebon Court, Chateau Brittany. Stop circumstances. Most peculiar. Stop. Your reputation precedes you. Stop. Inspector Beaumont, French police. Stop." "Sacré," Poirot muttered, his fingers drumming the arm of his chair. "Hastings, mon ami, what do you make of this summons?" "It seems clear enough," I replied, though Poirot's demeanor hinted at deeper complexities. "A death in France demanding his unique expertise, precision. But observe, if you please, the curious choice of words, circumstances. Most peculiar, not suspicious or mysterious, but peculiar. What does this suggest to the trained mind? I confess, I saw nothing particularly significant in the phrasing, but Poirot's enthusiasm was unmistakable. Within 2 hours we were aboard the Dover-Calais ferry, and by evening found ourselves rattling through the Breton countryside in a hired motor car, our driver navigating by lamplight through an increasingly dense fog. The Chateau of Ebon Court materialized from the mist like something from a Gothic romance, a forbidding silhouette of gray stone towers and steep slater roofs perched dramatically upon the cliffs overlooking the wild Atlantic, even in the dim light. I could discern the ancient quality of the place, its medieval foundations softened by Renaissance additions that spoke of wealth and refinement. "Mondour," Poirot whispered, as our motor-sea car crunched across the gravel courtyard. "It is a setting most appropriate. For mystery, is it not?" Our arrival was greeted by Inspector Beaumont, a stocky man in his 40s, whose harried expression suggested he had been awaiting our coming with considerable anxiety. He hurried forward as we alighted, his relief evident. "Mu puo. Captain Hastings, thank heaven you've come so quickly." His English, though accented, was perfectly serviceable. "I confess myself completely at sea with this affair." "Allo," Inspector Poirot replied with a slight bow. "Perhaps you will be so good as to acquaint us with the fact." As we were ushered into the Chateau's impressive entrance hall, a soaring space dominated by an enormous stone fireplace and ancient tapestries, Inspector Beaumont began his account. "The victim is Monsieur Armand Delacroix, age 67, lord of this estate for the past 30 years. He was discovered this morning by his manservant, locked in his private study, dead at his desk. The cause of death?" Poirot inquired, his sharp gaze taking in every detail of our surroundings. "Poison, we believe. The local physician suspects strychnine, though we wait confirmation from Rennes. But that is not the most curious aspect of the case." We had reached the door of the study, and Inspector Beaumont paused dramatically. "Missy, Diokwa was found with this clutched in his right hand. He produced a small evidence bag containing what appeared to be half of an ornate brass key, its intricate scrollwork broken clean through the middle. Most interesting, Poirot murmured, examining the broken key through the transparent bag, and the other half not found. But there is more. The inspector led us to an antique desk where a black silk envelope lay open. This was beside the body. Containing these from within the envelope, he carefully extracted 6 more keys, each similar in design. To the broken one but whole, each bore a small parchment tag tied with black ribbon. Pugh moved closer. His eyes are light with interest. If you please, Inspector, the names upon the tags: Madame Evangeline Moreau, Dr. Philippard, Monsieur Jules Bon, my own elder brother. I might add Miss Catherine Ashworth, Professor Reed Drain, and Monsieur Victor Lamartin. And these individuals, they are presently in residence, all arrived yesterday afternoon. At Monsieur Delacroix's invitation, they were to spend the weekend here for what? The Master Calada, a gathering of old friends and associates. I watched as Poirot's mind began to work upon this curious puzzle, his head tilted at that familiar angle which indicated deep concentration. The arrangements for this weekend, Inspector, they were of long standing. According to the staff, Nizi Diokwa sent the invitations only a fortnight ago, most urgent in their tone. According to his secretary, each guest was specifically requested to arrive Friday afternoon and remain through Sunday. T.I.I. Poirot exclaimed softly, and the purpose of this gathering, Inspector Beaumont's expression grew troubled. That Li Po is where the matter becomes truly peculiar. According to the butler, Siadokwa announced at dinner last evening that he intended to make a revelation which would illuminate certain betrayals of the past. His exact words, according to multiple witnesses, Trent, and the reaction of his guests to this announcement, mixed, one might say, several, appeared uncomfortable, though whether from guilt or merely embarrassment at their host's dramatic manner I cannot determine. Poirot nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the 7 keys. 6 whole one. Broken these keys, Inspector, they unlock with that MC Pooh. We have not yet determined. They appear to be quite old, possibly antique, and of a design unfamiliar to the household staff. As if summoned by our discussion, an elderly man in butler's livery appeared at the study door, his dignified bearing only slightly disturbed by the evening's tragic events. Forgive the intrusion, Inspector, he said with grave courtesy. The guests are becoming most anxious. Several have inquired about departing for Paris this evening. Nom Poirot interjected sharply. That must not be permitted, Inspector. Surely you have not allowed anyone to leave? Certainly not. This is now a murder investigation, and all present are potential witnesses or suspects. The butler cleared his throat delicately. If I may. Gentlemen, the guests have assembled in the grand salon. They're most eager to understand the situation. Poirot straightened his jacket with characteristic precision and adjusted his tie. Then, Masami, it is time to make the acquaintance of our 6 key holders. But first, Hastings, what impressions do you form from what we have learned? I considered carefully. It seems clear that Delacroix planned some sort of confrontation with his guests. The broken key in his hand suggests he was prevented from completing whatever revelation he intended exact, and the significance of the keys themselves, perhaps they represent some sort of symbolic justice or access to evidence of the betrayals he mentioned. Your reasoning improves. Mon ami Poirot's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Come, let us meet these 6 individuals whose names are inscribed upon keys of mystery. I have the distinct impression that before this case reaches its conclusion, we shall discover that the past and present are more intimately connected than appearances suggest. The fog had thickened outside the Château's diamond-paned windows, and as we followed Inspector Beaumont toward the Grand Salon. I could not shake the feeling that we were walking deeper into a web of secrets that stretched back far beyond the events of this fatal weekend, Chapter 2. The weekend that never was the Grand Salon of Huron Court proved to be a magnificent chamber that spoke eloquently of the Delacroix family's long prosperity. Persian carpets covered polished oak floors, while portraits of stern-faced ancestors gazed down from gilded frames. A fire crackled in the enormous stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the assembled company, who had risen at our entrance with varying degrees of composure. 6 individuals awaited us, their faces bearing that particular expression of controlled anxiety, which I had learned to recognize in those who find themselves unexpectedly entangled in matters of violent death. Inspector Beaumont performed the introductions with the mechanical precision of a man who had clearly rehearsed this moment. Monsieur Poirot, Captain. Hastings, may I present the guests of the late Monsieur Decroix. The first to step forward was a woman of perhaps 55 years, her elegant bearing unmarred by the tragic circumstances. Madame Evangeline Moreau possessed that particular brand of Parisian sophistication that speaks of wealth, taste, and careful attention to appearances. Her black silk dress was perfectly appropriate for the occasion, yet I noticed how her gloved hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she acknowledged our introduction. Miss Poirot, Yuska, she said, her voice cultured and controlled. What a terrible business this is. Poor Armand, who could have wished him harm? That, madame, is precisely what I intend to discover. Poirot replied with a slight bow. But first, if you would be so kind, your connection to the deceased. A fleeting expression crossed her features, so quick that a less observant man might have missed it entirely. We were old friends, I knew, Armand, many years ago before my marriage. We had renewed our acquaintance recently. Ah, oui, and you came to Ebon Court at his invitation, naturally, though I confess his letter was rather dramatic in tone. He spoke of revelations and truths that must be told. She paused, her dark eyes clouded with what might have been genuine bewilderment. I cannot imagine what Hamiot Dr. Philippe Henal, a distinguished gentleman of 60, with silver hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, spoke next with the measured cadence of one accustomed to delivering professional opinions. I served as the family physician to Monsieur Decroix for nearly 20 years. He explained, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that suggested nervous energy. Carefully controlled his summons. Came as a surprise, I must admit. Our relationship had become somewhat strained in recent months. Tia Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. Strained in what manner, doctor? Professional disagreements, de Renard replied curtly. Armand had developed certain theories about his family's past that I considered healthy obsessions. He consulted other physicians, sought second opinions on matters that were best left undisturbed before Poirot could pursue this intriguing line of inquiry. A robust man with graying temples and an unmistakably military bearing stepped forward. The family resemblance to Inspector Beaumont was immediately apparent. Jules Beaumont, wake, he announced with a firm handshake. Retired colonel, though that matters little. Now Armand and I were boys together in this very chateau. His father and mine were close friends. We maintained our friendship through the years, though he hesitated, glancing toward his younger brother. Oh, we had grown apart recently. Recent estrangement seems to be a theme among Mercurio de Lacroix's associates. Poirot observed mildly what caused this distance between old friends. Colonel Beaumont's jaw tightened. A hand had become obsessed with genealogy, family histories, old scandals best forgotten. He made accusations, suggested improprieties in our family's past. Frankly, Monsieur Poirot. I began to question his mental stability. A soft voice interrupted from across the room. If I may, Miss Catherine Ashworth proved to be woman of perhaps 30, plainly dressed, but with intelligent hazel eyes and an air of quiet competence. Her English accent marked her as a foreigner in this gathering of French nationals I was engaged by. Monsieur Delacroix, 3 months ago. She continued, though not as initially claimed, as a governess. There are no children at Ebon Court instead. He required assistance with his genealogical research, specifically the translation of English documents relating to his family's history. Tressine Poole leaned forward with obvious fascination. And what manner of documents, mademoiselle? Court records, mainly legal proceedings from the 18th century. Monsieur Delacroix was particularly interested in cases involving accusations of witchcraft and heresy, rather grim reading. I'm afraid a scholarly-looking gentleman with a pointed beard and nervous manner cleared his throat. Professor Shrine, he introduced himself with a slight bow, local historian and occasional collaborator. With the late Monsieur Delacroix, though collaborator may be too generous a term for our recent interactions. Professor Poole acknowledged your area of expertise, Breton history, particularly the medieval and Renaissance periods. Armel consulted me extensively about his family's ancestry, but we had philosophical differences about the interpretation of historical evidence. In what respect Professor Dufresne shifted uncomfortably, Armand became convinced that a great injustice had been perpetrated against his family in the past. He wanted me to help him prove certain theories that I considered historically unsound. When I refused to endorse his conclusions, he accused me of academic cowardice. The final member of our group had remained silent throughout. These introductions, a thin, nervous man with darting eyes and fidgeting hands. When Poirot's attention turned to him, he started as if awakened from deep thought. Victor Lamartine, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Art dealer from Paris, Messai Delacroix, recently approached me about certain paintings, family portraits and such, some quite valuable if authentic. And were they authentic? Miserela? Oh yes, certainly 17th and 18th century works, excellent provenance. But our mold seemed less interested in their monetary value than in their historical significance. Poirot's eyes gleamed with that particular light. I had learned to associate with the detection of an important clue. Historical significance in what? Lamartine glanced nervously around the room before answering. He claimed the paintings contained evidence, visual proof, he called it, of crimes committed centuries ago. Frankly, I thought him slightly mad. Inspector Beaumont stepped forward, his professional demeanor reasserting itself. According to the Chateau staff MC, Delacroix announced at dinner last evening that he intended to reveal what he termed betrayals of the past during this weekend gathering. Did any of you understand what he meant by this? A chorus of denials met this question, though I noticed several meaningful glances exchanged among the guests. Clearly each harbored suspicions about the others, true reasons for accepting Delacroix's invitation. Nay, Poirot said, rising from his chair with characteristic precision. It appears that our host invited you here under false pretenses. This was not to be a pleasant weekend among old friends, but rather a tribunal of sorts. Mr. Delacroix clearly believed that one or more of you had committed some transgression, perhaps connected to your family histories that required public exposure. The silence that greeted this observation was profound and telling. Dr. Renard was the first to break it. If that is so. Jury. Poirot, then perhaps his death was not entirely unexpected. A man who threatens to expose secrets must expect retaliation. Precisement, doctor. Which brings us to the matter of these mysterious keys. Poirot produced the evidence bag containing the 6 whole keys. Each bears the name of one among you. Clearly, they were intended to play a role in whatever revelation Monsieur Delacroix planned. The question that now presents itself Is this what do these keys unlock before anyone could respond? The elderly butler appeared. In the doorway, his face grave, with additional unwelcome news. "Forgive the interruption, Inspector," he said with formal dignity, "but I thought you should know immediately the storm has worsened considerably, and the bridge connecting the chateau to the mainland has suffered damage. The local authorities report it will be impossible until repairs can be effected." A murmur of consternation rippled through the assembled company. Colonel Beaumont voiced what everyone was thinking. "You mean we're trapped here for the present?" "Yes, sir, weather permitting. Repairs might be completed by Monday, but more likely Tuesday or Wednesday, as the implications of this news settled upon the group." I observed Poirot's expression with growing unease. His eyes held that particular gleam which indicated his little gray cells were working at maximum efficiency, but there was something else, a shadow of concern that I had rarely seen in his composed features. The killer, it seemed, had not finished with the weekend's planned revelations. We were now all prisoners of Ebon Court, trapped with a murderer whose game had only just begun. Chapter 3, The First Key Vanishes. Dawn broke gray and forbidding over Ebon Court. The Atlantic mists, clinging to the Chartow's ancient stones like ghostly fingers. I had passed a restless night, troubled by dreams of broken keys and shadowy figures moving through moonlit corridors. The howling wind that had battered the chateau throughout the night had finally subsided, leaving an ominous silence broken only by the distant crash of waves against the cliffs below. It was, perhaps, 7 when urgent knocking at my chamber door roused me from an uneasy doze. I opened it to find Inspector Beaumont, his face pale and drawn with exhaustion. "Captain Hastings," he said, his voice tight with controlled panic, "please wake Mzee Poo. Immediately, we have another death." Within minutes, Poirot and I had dressed hastily and followed the inspector through the chateau's labyrinthine corridors. Our destination proved to be the conservatory, a magnificent glass-walled chamber that in happier times must have been a paradise of exotic plants and flowering shrubs, now in the gray morning light. It possessed an almost sepulchral atmosphere. Madame Evangeline Marot lay crumpled at the base of a marble statue depicting some classical goddess. Her elegant black evening dress spread around her like the wings of a fallen raven. Her neck was bent at an unnatural angle, and a thin trickle of blood had dried on her temple, where it had apparently struck the statue's base. "Mont," Poirot whispered, approaching the body with characteristic caution. "When was she discovered?" 20 minutes ago by the gardener," Inspector Beaumont replied. "He comes early to tend the plants." Found the conservatory door standing open, and Madame Marot. "As you see her?" I watched as my friend began his methodical examination of the scene, his green eyes missing nothing. The conservatory's tiled floor was pristine around the body, showing no signs of struggle or disturbance indeed, apart from the tragic figure of Madame Moreau herself. Everything appeared to be in perfect order. "Curious," Poirot murmured, kneeling beside the body without touching it. "Hastings, what do you observe?" "I studied the scene carefully. It appears she fell and struck her head on the statue. Perhaps she came here during the night, stumbled in the darkness. Mourn me, but regard more closely the lady's evening dress. Is it not remarkably clean for someone who has taken such a tumble?" He was quite right. Madame Moreau's black silk gown showed no signs of dust, dirt, or disarray beyond what the fall itself might have caused. Her hair, though disturbed, retained much of its careful arrangement, and her pearls lay unbroken about her throat. Furthermore, Poirot continued, rising with that fluid grace which belied his ears. "Observe the position of the body. If Madame had fallen naturally, would she not have landed differently? And these marble chips," he indicated, several small fragments of white marble scattered near the statue's base, chips that appeared fresh, their surfaces bright against the darker tiles. Inspector Beaumont frowned. You suspect foul play? I suspect, Monomythe, that this death is not what it appears to be. But first, let us examine what our mysterious correspondent has left for us. It was then that I noticed the sheet of parchment pinned to the conservatory's entrance door, a message written in an archaic hand that seemed to mock us with its formal script. Pride goeth before the fall justice from our Claire 1732 Sacre, Poole exclaimed, studying the note intently. And now, Inspector, perhaps you would be so good as to check the black envelope in your evidence room. The inspector's face grew ashen. A understanding dawned when he returned from the study. 10 minutes later, High's expression confirmed our fears. Madame Moreau's key, he announced grimly, has vanished from the collection. Dr. Renard arrived shortly, afterwards summoned from his breakfast to examine the body. His professional composure seemed strained as he knelt beside his former acquaintance, and noticed how his hand shook slightly as he conducted his preliminary examination. Broken neck, he concluded after several minutes. Death would have been instantaneous, consistent with a fall. He paused, glancing meaningfully at Poirot. There are certain irregularities I cannot fully explain, such as, Doctor, the angle of impact for one thing, and these contusions on her shoulders, very faint, but suggestive of restraint. While Dr. Renard completed High's examination, Poirot had been exploring the conservatory with systematic thoroughness. His attention was particularly drawn to a section of the glass wall that afforded a view of the Chateau's portrait gallery. Tracurio, he murmured, producing his magnifying glass to examine something that had caught his eye. What is it, Poirot? I inquired. Observe Hastings. This window pane, do you not detect a small crack here, at precisely the height where someone might have been pressed against the glass indeed? There was a hairline fracture in the glass, so fine as to be nearly invisible. Around it, I could just make out what might have been the impression of fabric, or perhaps a gloved hand. Someone was watching, Poirot concluded. But watching what or whom? Our investigation was interrupted by the arrival of the other guests, drawn by the commotion. Colonel Beaumont appeared genuinely shaken by the news of Madame Moreau's death, while Professor Dufresne seemed more puzzled than distressed. Miss Ashworth maintained her composed demeanor, though I noticed she avoided looking directly at the body. Victor Lamartine appeared positively ill, his nervous disposition clearly overwhelmed by these tragic developments. This is intolerable, Colonel Beaumont declared first. Errol now, poor Evangeline, Inspector. Surely you don't believe this was an accident. At present, we are investigating all possibilities, Inspector Beaumont replied diplomatically. Professor Dufresne stepped forward, his scholarly mind evidently working on the historical reference in the mysterious note. This Marclair mentioned in the message. The date, 1732, corresponds to a particularly dark period in local history. There were accusations of witchcraft trials, executions. Exact, monk Professor Poirot interrupted. And I believe we shall find that this historical connection is far from coincidental. But first, we must examine the Charteau's portrait gallery. I have the impression it will prove most illuminating. The portrait gallery occupied the Charteau's eastern wing, a long chamber lined with paintings spanning 3 centuries of Delacroix family history. Elaborate gold frames held the images of stern patriarchs, elegant ladies, and solemn children, their painted eyes seeming to follow our movements with silent judgment. Poirot moved along the gallery with obvious purpose, pausing before each portrait to study not only the subject, but also the small brass plaques that identified the sitters and dates. His progress was methodical until he reached a particular painting near the gallery's center, a portrait of a young woman with dark hair and haunting eyes, her Renaissance-style dress suggesting wealth and position. The plaque beneath read simply, Mary Claire Delacroix, 1715, to 1732. But, voila, Poirot said softly. Here is our Marclair, and observe, if you please, the dates of her brief life. I studied the portrait with growing fascination. The young woman's face held an expression of quiet dignity, but there was something in her eyes, a shadow of sadness, or perhaps foreknowledge of tragedy, that made the painting peculiarly affecting. She died at 17, I observed, rather young, even for Thatera, indeed. Hastings, and I suspect her death was neither natural nor peaceful. Professor Dufresne, what can you tell us of this ancestor of our late host? The historian approached the portrait with obvious reluctance. Marie Claire Decois was indeed a tragic figure accused of witchcraft in 1732. She died under questionable circumstances. The records are incomplete, but they suggest a conspiracy of enemies who coveted her property and sought to destroy her reputation. And these enemies. Poirot inquired with deceptive casualness. Their names are recorded. Professor Dufresne's discomfort was evident. Some of them, yes, local families of prominence who benefited from her disgrace and death. Before he could elaborate further, a tremendous crash echoed through the shadow, followed by shouts of alarm from the direction of the kitchen quarters. We hurried toward the sound, leaving Marclair's painted eyes to gaze eternally from her gilded frame, holding secrets that had remained buried for 2 centuries, but were now, it seemed, demanding their terrible accounting. Chapter 4, Shadows of the Past. The crash that had interrupted our examination of Mary Claw's portrait proved to be nothing more sinister than kitchen maid's mishap with a tray of china. But the incident served to heighten the already taut nerves of everyone within Ebon Court's walls. As we returned to the portrait gallery, I could not help but notice how the remaining guests moved in clusters, as if seeking safety in numbers, their eyes darting nervously at every shadow. The enforced confinement was beginning to tell upon them all. The bridge remained impassable. The telephone lines had been severed by the storm, and the sense of isolation grew more oppressive with each passing hour. It was clear that our mysterious killer had planned these circumstances with diabolical precision. Poirot resumed his study of Marclair's portrait with renewed intensity, his head tilted at that characteristic angle which indicated deep concentration. Professor Dufresne hovered nearby, his scholarly composure clearly strained by the morning's tragic events. Professor Poirot said, without turning from the painting, I believe the time has come for complete candor. What precisely do you know of Mary Claire Delacroix's fate? Dufresne glanced nervously at the other guests before responding. The records are fragmented. You understand, much was deliberately destroyed or lost over the centuries, naturellement. But what remains, Mary Claire was the youngest daughter of the Delacroix family, orphaned at 15 when her parents died in a riding accident. She inherited considerable property, not only this shadow, but also valuable coastal lands and a substantial dowry by all accounts. She was intelligent, beautiful, and devoutly religious, and yet she was accused of witchcraft. Miss Ashworth interjected her professional interest. In historical documents evident, the accusations came from several sources. Professor Duane Rain continued reluctantly. Local families who had disputes with the Delacroix estate, a magistrate who had been denied her hand in marriage, and various others who stood to benefit from her downfall. Dr. Renard, who had been listening with obvious discomfort, cleared his throat. Professor, these are ancient matters. Surely they have no bearing on our present difficulties. On the contrary, Doctor, Poirot replied, his eyes never leaving the painted face of Marclair, I suspect these ancient matters are precisely the key to understanding our current predicament. Professor, please continue. The accusations were comprehensive. Dufresne admitted she was said to have practiced sorcery, to have caused the failure of local crops, to have cursed her enemies with various misfortunes. All nonsense, of course. But in 1732, such charges were taken seriously. And the trial Poirot inquired, 3, was no proper trial. The evidence against her was largely testimonial witnesses who claimed to have seen her consorting with the devil, performing unholy rituals, and so forth. The magistrate, a man named Henri Dufresne, the professor, paused his face, flushing with embarrassment. "Ah," Poirot said softly, "your ancestor, Professor. My great-great-grandfather, yes. I have always been deeply ashamed of his role in the affair." Colonel Beaumont frowned. "What role exactly?" Professor Drain's voice dropped to belly. Above a whisper, he accepted bribes to ensure Marie Claire's conviction. The trial was a sham. The evidence fabricated, the witnesses coached. She was condemned to death for crimes she never committed. But the date on her portrait, I observed, shows she died in 1732. Surely, if she were executed for witchcraft, there would be records. That is the most tragic aspect of the entire affair. Miss Ashworth said, consulting a leather-bound notebook she had produced, Visy de la Quire, showed me the documents. Mary Claire was not executed. She died in prison before the sentence could be carried out, apparently from a fever, though the circumstances were suspicious. Suspicious in what manner? Poirot asked sharply. The prison physician who attended her was Dr. Philip Renard. Miss Ashworth replied, reading from her notes. He reported that she had succumbed to a sudden illness, but other prisoners claimed she had been poisoned. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Dr. Renard's face had gone ashen, and his hands trembled as he gripped the back of a nearby chair. "My ancestor," he said hoarsely. "The physician, who may have," he could not finish the sentence, "who may have murdered an innocent girl to prevent her from exposing the conspiracy against her," Poirot concluded. With grave finality, Victor Learton, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke up with obvious agitation. "This is madness. You're suggesting that we are all somehow connected to this ancient crime, are you not?" Monsieur Martin Poirot turned his penetrating gaze upon the art dealer. "I wonder what your researches into the Chateau's art collection revealed about your own family's involvement in Marlaire's fate lamb." Martin's nervous demeanor intensified. "That is, my ancestor was merely a merchant who purchased some of her possessions after her death perfectly legally, I assure you. Benur purchased from whom one wonders, and at what price." Before Lamartin could respond, Colonel Beaumont stepped forward with military directness. "Sure. Poirot, suggesting that this killer, whoever murdered Arnold and poor Evangeline, believes we are all guilty of some inherited sin. I am suggesting, Colonel, that someone has discovered the truth about Mary Cleelqua's persecution and death, and has decided that justice delayed is not justice denied. The question that now presents itself is this: which among you is descended from Mary Claire herself and therefore seeks vengeance for her wrongs? This startling possibility sent a visible shock through assembled company. Each person glanced suspiciously at the others, as if seeing them in an entirely new light. "Impossible," Dr. Renard protested. "Marlaire died unmarried and childless, did she?" Poirot moved along the portrait gallery, examining other paintings. "With renewed interest, Miss Ashworth, in your research of the documents, did you encounter any references to Mary Claire's personal relationships?" The young woman consulted her notebook again. There were rumors of a secret romance, but nothing substantiated. The records were deliberately obscured on such matters, precisely because an heir to Mary Claire, even an illegitimate one, would have had a claim to her property and a powerful motive to expose the conspiracy against her, as if summoned by his words. The elderly butler appeared in the gallery doorway, his dignified composure somewhat ruffled by urgency. "Forgive me, Inspector," he announced, "but we have discovered something in the Cartau's foundation chambers that I believe you should see immediately." Inspector Beaumont looked to Poirot, who nodded decisively. Lead on Monami. I suspect we're about to uncover more of Marclaire's secrets. The descent to the foundation chambers took us through a narrow stone stairway that spoke of the Charteau's medieval origins. The butler's lantern cast dancing shadows on walls that had stood for centuries, and I could not suppress a shiver as we delved deeper into the Charteau's ancient heart. The chamber we entered was clearly much older than the rest of the building, a vaulted stone room that might have served as a chapel or shrine in earlier times. Along one wall stood several wooden chests, their surfaces covered with dust and cobwebs that suggested they had remained undisturbed for generations. Wet as scubbert. This room only this morning, the butler explained. The storm loosened some stones in the wall above, revealing the entrance. Monsieur d'Aqua had been searching for such a chamber for months. Based on references in old family documents, Poirot approached the nearest chest with reverent care, lifting its lid to reveal a collection of personal effects that took my breath away. Here were Mary Claire's possessions, her jewelry, her prayer book letters tied with faded ribbon, and, most remarkably, a detailed journal written in her own hand. Mon Dieu, Poirot whispered. Handling the journal with infinite delicacy, Marclaire has left us her testamentals. He carefully opened the leather-bound volume, the brittle pages revealing secrets that had lain hidden for 2 centuries. I realized that we were about to learn the full truth of what had happened in 1850, 1732, and perhaps discover the identity of the killer who now stalked the corridors of Ebon Court, driven by an inherited thirst for justice that had waited nearly 300 years for its fulfillment. Chapter 5, The Magistrate's Justice. The ancient pages of Marclaire's journal seemed to whisper their secrets in the flickering lantern light. As Poirot carefully turned each delicate leaf, the young woman's handwriting was elegant despite the obvious emotion with which many passages had been penned, and her words painted a vivid picture of the conspiracy that had destroyed her life. Listen to this, May. Poirot said, his voice reverent as he read aloud from an entry dated mere days before Mary Claire's death. They believe they have silenced me with their false accusations and purchased witnesses. But I have hidden the truth where it cannot be destroyed. Let those who come after know that Drain accepted gold to pervert justice, that Fight Renard agreed to declare me mad to ensure my condemnation, and that Jeho Professor Duainra started violently Gisbo. But that is impossible, my research showed. No Beaumont family involvement in the affair. Poirot continued reading that Jules Beaumont, captain of the local militia, provided false testimony about my supposed midnight rituals in exchange for grants of my coastal properties. Colonel Beaumont's face had gone rigid with shock. My ancestor was a military man, yes, but I had no knowledge of any connection to this Marclaire business. The journal reveals much. Poirot observed, turning another page with infinite care. But we must not linger over these revelations. Now time, I fear, is not our ally, indeed. The atmosphere within the Chateau had grown increasingly oppressive. As the day wore on, the remaining guests moved about with obvious nervous tension, starting at every sound and regarding each other with undisguised suspicion. The knowledge that they were potentially descended from Marclaire's persecutors had cast a pall over the entire company that no amount of rational discourse could dispel. It was perhaps 4:00 in the afternoon when Inspector Beaumont discovered us in the Chateau's library, where Poirot had been methodically examining Professor Dufresne's research materials. The inspector's face bore an expression of grave concern that immediately commanded our attention. Monsieur Poirot, he announced, we cannot locate Professor Drain. He has not been seen since luncheon, and his room appears to have been vacated. Sacre Poirot rose immediately from his chair. How long since he was last observed? Nearly 3 hours, the servants assumed he was, resting in his chamber. But when the maid went to turn down his bed, she found the room empty. We hurried through the Château's corridors with mounting urgency, calling the professor's name and searching each room systematically. It was Miss Ashworth who suggested we examine the library more thoroughly, noting that Dufresne had expressed particular interest in certain historical manuscripts housed there. The library of Ebon Court was a magnificent chamber-lined floor-to-ceiling with leather-bound volumes, many of which appeared to date back several centuries. Tall windows provided ample natural light during the day, and several reading tables were scattered throughout the space, each equipped with proper lamps for scholarly work. We found Professor Dufresne slumped over one of these tables, his head resting upon an opened manuscript whose vellum pages were stained with what appeared to be spilled tea. His spectacles had fallen from his face and lay broken on the floor beside his chair. "Mont," Poirot whispered, approaching the still form with characteristic caution. "Dr. Renard, if you please." Dr. Renard's examination was swift but thorough, his professional composure reasserting itself despite the tragic circumstances. "Dead for some time," he concluded grimly. "Perhaps 2 hours or more. The symptoms," he paused, glancing meaningfully at Poirot, "they are consistent with the same toxin that killed our poison." "Again, Inspector," Beaumont muttered. "But how the professor took no refreshment since luncheon, and he dined with the others." Poirot was examining the manuscript over which Dufresne had been found, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to the naked eye. "Observe, Hastings, the staining upon these pages. It is not tea, as first appears, but something more sinister indeed. Under Poirot's glass, the stains showed a peculiar crystalline residue that caught the light with an almost metallic gleam. The poison was applied to the manuscript itself," Poirot concluded when the professor turned. "The pages, handling them in the normal course of his research, the toxin was absorbed through his skin." "Diabolical!" Colonel Beaumont exclaimed. But who could have known he would examine this particular document? Before anyone could respond, Miss Ashworth drew our attention to a sheet of parchment that had been placed prominently upon a nearby reading stand. The now familiar archaic script proclaimed, "The corrupt judge meets his judgment justice for Marclair, 1732. Professor Dufresne's key," Inspector Beaumont said grimly, checking the black envelope. "Gone like the others?" As Dr. Renard completed his examination of the body, I noticed Poirot studying the manuscript that had been the instrument of death. It was clearly very old, its Latin text illuminated with elaborate marginalia and decorative elements typical of medieval religious documents. "What is this manuscript exactly?" inquired. "A chronicle of local ecclesiastical proceedings from the early 18th century, Poirot replied, his voice thoughtful. "But see here, Hastings, someone has made recent annotations in the margins, cross-referencing certain passages with modern genealogical research." Indeed, penciled notes in what appeared to be Professor Dufresne's handwriting connected various Latin names with their modern descendants. The professor had been tracing family lineages, documenting the connections between Marclair's persecutors and their living relatives. He was verifying the accuracy of his ancestors' role in the conspiracy, Miss Ashworth observed, reading over Poirot's shoulder. These notes show he had confirmed not only his own family's involvement, but also— She paused, her face growing pale as she studied the genealogical annotations more closely. "What is it?" Mademoiselle Poirot asked sharply. According to these notes, Professor Dufresne had discovered something unexpected about the Delqua family line itself. There are references here to a secret marriage, a hidden child. Tia Poirot's eyes gleamed with sudden understanding. The professor had uncovered evidence of Marie Claire's heir, the descendant who now seeks vengeance for her wrongs. Colonel Beaumont frowned, but surely if such evidence existed, it would have been discovered long ago, not necessarily Colonel. Consider the circumstances: a young woman facing death, desperate to protect Agatha from her enemy's vengeance. She would have gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal the birth and ensure the infant's safety. As if to confirm this theory, Victor Lamine appeared in the library doorway, his face flushed with excitement and terror. "The portrait," he gasped in the gallery. "Someone has altered Marie Claire's portrait." Hurried to the portrait gallery, where a shocking discovery awaited us. Marla's painting had indeed been changed, but not damaged or defaced. Instead, someone had carefully cleaned away centuries of overpainting to reveal details that had been deliberately obscured. The young woman's figure, previously shown alone in the formal pose typical of aristocratic portraits, now clearly depicted her holding a infant. Detail that had been painted over shortly after the original work was completed. "Voila, Poirot," said softly. Marie Claire was not childless, as history recorded she had given birth, and someone took great pains to hide this fact from her enemies. The implications were staggering. Somewhere among us, or perhaps among the chateau's staff, walked a direct descendant of Marie Claire de Quarmbe, with documentary proof of the conspiracy that had destroyed their ancestor, and driven by a thirst for justice that had waited 3 centuries for satisfaction, as the shadows lengthened in the portrait gallery, and Mary Claw's painted eyes seemed to watch us with renewed intensity. I realized that our killer's methodical revenge was far from complete. 3 keys had vanished. 3 descendants of the original conspirators lay dead, and the remaining guests, Dr. Renard, Colonel Beaumont, Miss Ashworth, and Victor Lamartin, faced the terrifying certainty that one among them would be next to face Mary Claire's long-delayed justice. Chapter 6. The art of deception. The discovery of Mary Claire's hidden child had cast an entirely new light upon our investigation, and I could see from Poirot's expression that his little gray cells were working at maximum capacity. The remaining guests had withdrawn to the salon after the shocking revelation about the portrait, their faces bearing the haunted look of people who realize they are being systematically hunted. Night had fallen over Ebon Court with particular malevolence, the Atlantic winds howling around the chateau's ancient stones like the voices of the vengeful dead. The electricity had flickered intermittently throughout the evening, adding to the Gothic atmosphere that seemed to permeate every corner of the building. It was perhaps 9:30 when Victor Lamarine failed to appear for dinner. At first, his absence provoked little concern. The art dealer's nervous disposition had led him to skip several meals since the murders began, however. When Miss Ashworth mentioned that she had seen him descending toward the wine cellars shortly after tea, Inspector Beaumont organized an immediate search. The cellars of Ebon Court were extensive, carved directly into the living rock. Beneath the chateau's foundations, ancient wine racks stretched into shadows that seemed to swallow our lantern light, and the air was heavy with the musty scent of centuries-old vintages and something that made my skin crawl with inexplicable dread. We found Victor Lamartin in the deepest section of the cellars, sprawled beside a valuable painting that had been systematically destroyed. The canvas, which even in its damaged state showed the unmistakable elegance of 18th century French artistry, lay in ribbons around his body, as if someone had attacked it with a knife in a frenzy of deliberate destruction. "Want you, Bernard," Poirot whispered, kneeling beside the body with his characteristic care. "Doctor, if you please." Dr. Renard's examination was swift but thorough, his hands trembling slightly as he worked the same poison he concluded grimly administered perhaps an hour. Ego judging by the rigor and the painting, Inspector Beaumont inquired, studying the destroyed artwork. With professional interest, Poirot was examining the shredded canvas with his magnifying glass, piecing together fragments like a macabre jigsaw puzzle. Observe the signature in the lower corner, partially visible, despite the damage. Mactiqua, 1931, Mary Claire painted. This Miss Ashworth asked, her voice filled with wonder and horror prime. And see here, Poirot indicated several fragments that, when properly arranged, revealed a partial scene of the chateau's gardens. This was no mere decorative work. It appears to be a detailed record of some specific event or location. Colonel Beaumont leaned close, squinting at the damaged canvas. There seemed to be figures. In the background, people gathered around. Something indeed. Colonel, I believe this painting was Mary Claire's visual testimony, evidence of her innocence, or perhaps documentation of her enemy's guilt. And now it has been destroyed to prevent its relevance. As if summoned by our discussion, the familiar parchment appeared pinned to a nearby wine rack. With the same archaic script we had come to dread, the thief returns what was stolen justice for Marie Claire, 1732, Lamartin's key. Inspector Beaumont confirmed. After checking the black envelope gone with the others, Miss Ashworth consulted her notebook. With obvious distress, according to Mesut Diokwa's research, the Lamartin family acquired several of Marie Claire's paintings after her death, purchased from the estate at remarkably low prices, stolen in effect. Poirot observed property seized from a woman condemned on false charges, sold to benefit those who orchestrated her destruction. As we prepared to leave the cellars, I noticed Poirot lingering beside the destroyed painting, his sharp eyes scanning the wine racks with unusual intensity. "Hastings," he said quietly, "observe these wine bottles. Dodo, you notice anything peculiar?" I studied the ancient racks, seeing nothing more than dust. Covered bottles, arranged in the traditional manner, they appear quite normal, Poirot, but regard more closely. Here, behind this rack of 1847 Bordeaux, do you not detect a draft indeed? There was a slight movement of air that suggested a hidden passage or chamber beyond the visible cellar walls. Poirot's investigation revealed a section of stone that moved when pressed, opening to reveal a narrow tunnel that disappeared into darkness. "Sacre!" he exclaimed. "Our killer has been using secret passages to move about the chateau undetected. This explains how the murders were accomplished with such precision and stealth." The tunnel proved to connect the cellars with various parts of the chateau through a network of passages that must have dated back to the building's medieval period. As we explored with our lanterns, we discovered that these hidden ways provided access to nearly every room in the building, including the conservatory where Madame Marot had died and the library where Professor Dufresne had met his end. The killer has intimate knowledge of the chateau's secrets, Poirot observed as we emerged from our subterranean exploration. This suggests either long residence here or extensive study of the building's history and construction. Returning to the main levels, we found the remaining guests huddled in the salon like survivors of shipwreck. Dr. Renard sat rigidly in a high-backed chair, his medical bag clutched protectively in his lap. Colonel Beaumont paced before the fireplace with military precision, while Miss Ashworth maintained her composure despite the obvious strain showing in her pale complexion. "4 dead, Dorster," Colonel Beaumont announced grimly as we entered. "Al Evangeline, the professor, and now poor Lamartine." "Inspector, surely you cannot believe these deaths are coincidental." "Certainly not, Colonel," Inspector Beaumont replied. "We are dealing with a calculating killer who has planned these murders with meticulous attention to detail." Dr. Renard looked up from his vigil, his face haggarded with fear and exhaustion. "The pattern is clear enough. We are being eliminated one by one, punished for the crimes of our ancestors. But how can we be held responsible for events that occurred centuries before our birth. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Doctor. Observed with grave finality, someone believes that the sins of the fathers must be visited upon their children. Miss Ashworth spoke quietly from her corner chair, her voice steady, despite the circumstances according to the documents I've translated. Marie Claire believed her persecutors would escape earthly punishment. Perhaps she or her descendant decided to ensure that divine justice would eventually be served. But which of us will be next? Dr. Renard asked, his voice cracking with barely controlled panic. And how can we protect ourselves against an enemy who strikes from the shadows? Move to stand. Before Marlaire's portrait, which had been moved to the salon for safekeeping, the young woman's painted eyes seemed to follow his movements, and the newly revealed infant in her arms served as a constant reminder that somewhere among us walked her, descendant armed with centuries-old grievances and an unquenchable thirst for revenge. The killer has made one crucial error. Poirot announced, his voice cutting through the oppressive atmosphere like a blade in revealing Marie Claire's child. Through the portrait restoration, they have provided us with the key to their identity. How so? Colonel Beaumont demanded. Because mon ami, only someone with access to the original painting techniques and materials could have accomplished such precise restoration work. This suggests specialized knowledge of art conservation knowledge that points directly to our killer's profession and identity. Before anyone could respond to this startling revelation, the lights flickered and died throughout the shadow, plunging us into a darkness broken only by the dying embers of the fire. In that moment of blind terror, as we fumbled for candles and lanterns, I heard the soft sound of footsteps moving with deadly purpose through the corridors of Ebon Court, and I knew that Mary Claude's descendant was preparing to strike again. Chapter 7. The doctor's prescription. The darkness that had engulfed Ebon Court proved to be mercifully brief. Inspector Beaumont quickly located the electrical switches that had been deliberately thrown, restoring light to the shadow within minutes. However, those few moments of blind terror had been sufficient for our killer to claim another victim, as we discovered when de Renard failed to respond to our calls from the salon. His room, Colonel Beaumont said. Grimly, he mentioned retiring early, said his nerves couldn't withstand much more of this nightmare. We found Dr. Renard's chamber door locked from within, a circumstance that filled us all with dread, given the pattern of deaths we had witnessed. Inspector Beaumont's repeated knocking produced no response, and ultimately we were forced to break down the heavy oak door to gain entry. The scene that greeted us was one of apparent tragedy, but suspicious circumstance. Dr. Renard lay peacefully upon his bed, fully clothed, his medical bag opened beside him, and an empty vial clutched in his lifeless hand. A sheet of hotel stationery lay upon the nightstand, covered with handwriting that appeared to be a confession. Mon tour, Poirot whispered, approaching the body with his characteristic caution. But this is most irregular. Is it not? Miss Ashworth, who had maintained her composure throughout the evening's horrors, picked up the confession with trembling fingers. He admits to all the murders, she read aloud, says he discovered his ancestors' role in Mary Claire's death, and couldn't bear the shame, claims he poisoned the others to prevent exposure of the conspiracy, then took his own life in remorse. How convenient, Colonels. Beaumont observed with bitter skepticism. The guilty party eliminates himself and provides us with a tidy explanation for this entire nightmare. Poirot was examining the supposed suicide scene with intense concentration, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to casual observation. Hastings, what do you make of the doctor's position? I studied the body carefully. Dr. Renard lay with his arms at its sides, the empty poison vial resting in his right palm in a manner that seemed almost ceremonial. His face bore an expression of peaceful repose, that seemed inconsistent with the violent death we had witnessed in the other victims. He appears remarkably composed for someone who has just consumed a fatal dose of poison. I observed precisimo, and observe, if you please, the handwriting of this confession. Poirot held the document to the light, examining it through his glass. What strikes you as peculiar? I compared the confession to prescriptions I had seen Dr. Renard write during his examination. Of the previous victims, the handwriting appears consistent, though perhaps somewhat more labored than usual. Exact more. But regard the ink. Mon ami, do you not detect variations in its consistency and color? Indeed, under closer scrutiny, the confession appeared to have been written with two different pens, as if composed over an extended period, or perhaps by someone copying the doctor's hand with painstaking care. Furthermore, Poirot continued moving it to examine Dr. Renard's medical bag. Observe what is missing from the doctor's professional equipment. The bag contained the usual instruments of medical practice, but I noticed that several vials were absent from their customary positions, more significantly, the poison that had presumably claimed. Dr. Renard's life was not among the medical supplies that remained. The killer has made several errors, Poirot announced with satisfaction. First, the positioning of the body suggests the doctor was placed upon the bed after death, rather than dying there. Naturally, second, the confession, while cleverly forged, shows subtle variations that betray its artificial nature. Third and most crucial, he moved to the chamber's window, examining the lock mechanism. With intense interest, the room was indeed locked from within, but observe these scratches around the keyhole. They are fresh, suggesting that the lock was manipulated from outside the room using specialized tools. Inspector Beaumont frowned. But how could anyone lock the door from the corridor? Poirot smiled with grim satisfaction by using one of our mysterious keys. Of course, the killer has been employing these antique keys not merely as symbols of justice, but as practical tools to stage impossible crimes. Miss Ashworth consulted her notebook with obvious agitation. But if Dr. Renard didn't write this confession, where is his key? It should still be in the black envelope. If he's innocent, Inspector Beaumont checked immediately his face, confirming our fears gone like all the others, because Poirot explained the killer removed it before staging this elaborate charade. They wished us to believe that Dr. Renard was our murderer, thus ending the investigation and allowing them to escape justice. Colonel Beaumont paced the chamber with military precision, his face grim with realization. Then we're down to three, you, Miss Ashworth, myself. And he paused, his eyes widening with sudden understanding. Inspector, where is your brother Jules? He should have been with us when we discovered the doctor's body. The question sent a chill through the assembled company. In our focus on Dr. Renard's apparent suicide, we had failed to notice that one of our number was conspicuously absent from the investigation. He complained of a headache after dinner. Inspector Beaumont replied, his voice tight with worry. Retired to his room before the lights went out, we hurried through the chateau's corridors to Colonel Beaumont's chamber, our footsteps echoing ominously in the ancient halls. The door stood slightly ajar, and a quick search revealed that the room was empty, but not unoccupied recently. The bed showed signs of use, and a glass of water sat half empty upon the nightstand. He's somewhere in the Hercule Poirot observed, studying the room for clues to the colonel's whereabouts. But where would he go in the middle of the night? Miss Ashworth spoke quietly from the doorway, her voice steady despite the obvious strain. Perhaps he's discovered something, evidence that could expose the killer's identity. Or perhaps Colonel Beaumont said grimly, he's become the next target. As if summoned by his words, a distant sound echoed. Through the shadow, the crash of breaking glass, followed by a cry of alarm. The sound appeared to come from the direction of the portrait gallery, and we hurried toward it. With mounting urgency, the gallery was empty when we arrived, but clear signs of a struggle were evident. One of the ancient portraits had been knocked askew, and fragments of a shattered vase lay scattered across the polished floor. Most ominously, drops of what appeared to be blood marked a trail leading toward the hidden passages we had discovered earlier. Hercule Poirot exclaimed, examining the blood spatters with his magnifying glass. The killer has taken Colonel Jules, but not without resistance. Inspector Beaumont's face was ashen with fear for his brother's safety. We must find him immediately. If the pattern holds, the killer intends to complete their revenge. Tonight, indeed, Poirot agreed, his voice grim with determination. But first, we must understand the killer's ultimate purpose. 4 descendants of Marclaire's persecutors are dead, 1 has been taken, and 2 remain. The question that now presents itself is this: does our killer intend to eliminate all the descendants? Or is there a more specific target, someone whose ancestor played the most crucial role in Marie Claire's destruction? Miss Ashworth consulted her research notes with obvious distress, according to the documents. While all the families participated in the conspiracy, one person bears the greatest responsibility. The magistrate who accepted bribes to ensure her conviction, and the physician who may have poisoned her in prison, Professor Drine, and Dr. Renard the Vogt, observed, both now dead exact, which suggests that our killer's primary targets have been eliminated, and the remaining deaths serve a different purpose, perhaps to conceal the true motive, or to ensure no witnesses survive to expose the truth. As we prepared to search the secret passages for Colonel Jules, a new horror presented itself. Lights began to flicker once more throughout the chateau, and in the unstable illumination, I could have sworn I saw a figure in white moving through the portrait gallery, a woman whose face bore an unmistakable resemblance to the painted Marclaire, who gazed down upon us with her eternal accusing eyes. The hunt for Colonel Jules and our final confrontation with Marclaire's descendant was about to begin in earnest somewhere in the labyrinthine depths of Ebon Court, where justice, delayed for 3 centuries, was preparing to exact its ultimate price. Chapter 8, The Seventh Key. The portrait gallery of Ebon Court had never seemed more appropriate a setting for the resolution of our mystery than it did. In those final tension-filled moments, Poirot had insisted that we gather there beneath Marclaire's restored painting, and as the remaining survivors assembled, Inspector Beaumont, Miss Ashworth, myself, and the chateau's elderly butler, I could not shake the feeling that we were participants in a drama that had been 3 centuries in the making. Colonel Jules had been discovered bound, but unharmed, in one of the secret passages, his abduction having served merely to heighten the drama of our killer's final revelation. He now sat beside his brother's military, bearing somewhat shaken by his ordeal, but his dignity intact. Mesame Poirot began, his voice carrying that particular authority which commanded absolute attention. We have witnessed this weekend a series of murders that appeared to be the work of someone seeking vengeance for historical injustices. 5 people are dead: Armand Delacroix, Madame Moreau, Professor Dufresne, Victor Lamartine, and Dr. Renard, each descended from those who participated in the persecution of Marclaire de Lacan, 1732. He moved to stand directly beneath the portrait, where Marclaire's painted eyes seemed to watch our proceedings with eternal judgment. The killer wished us to believe that these deaths were the work of Marclaire's descendant, seeking justice for crimes committed against their ancestor. The historical notes, the symbolic staging of each murder, the systematic elimination of the conspirators' bloodlines, all of this was designed to create the impression of hereditary vengeance. Miss Ashworth shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Are you suggesting that wasn't the motive, Monsieur pour Precisel? While the killer is indeed connected to Marie Claire, The true motive was far more immediate and personal than historical justice. Inspector Beaumont leaned forward with obvious interest. Then, who is our murderer? Poirot's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he began his methodical explanation. The killer made several crucial errors that revealed their identity. First, the restoration of Marie Claude's portrait to reveal her hidden child required specialized knowledge of art, conservation techniques. Second, the forgery of Dr. Renard's confession, while skillful, showed subtle variations that betrayed the hand of someone copying another's writing. Third, and most significantly, the killer possessed intimate knowledge of this chartau's secret passages and hidden chambers. He paused, allowing the implications to settle upon his audience, but the most revealing clue was the broken key found in Armand Delacroix's hand. You see, that key did not belong to any of the weekend guests. It contained the killer's true identity, which Delacroix had discovered just before his death. But the key was broken. Colonel Beaumont protested. How could it reveal anything? Ah, mon ami, but I have found the other half. Poirot produced a small evidence bag containing a fragment of brass that perfectly matched the piece found with Delacroix. It was hidden in a place where only someone with unrestricted access to the chateau could have concealed it. He turned to face the elderly butler, whose dignified composure had remained unchanged throughout the evening's revelations. Mouille Dubois, Poirot announced, or should I say, Henri Delacroix, Mar Claire's direct descendant. Through that hidden child shone in the portrait the butler's mascouf. Professional civility slipped for just a moment, revealing an expression of such hatred and triumph that it transformed his entire appearance. Maitre Claire was my great-great-grandmother. He said, his voice no longer carrying the deferential tone of a servant she bore son before her death, my ancestor who was spirited away to safety before. The conspiracy could destroy him as well, and you have served the Delacroix family. For how long? Poirot inquired. 40 years, Dubois replied with bitter satisfaction. 40 years of waiting, planning, documenting every detail of their family history and connections. Armand never suspected that his trusted butler was the heir to the fortune that should rightfully have been mine. Inspector Beaumont found his voice. But why? Now why not claim your inheritance through legal channels? Dubois laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. Legal channels, the same legal system that condemned an innocent girl to death for the crime of possessing what others coveted. No, Inspector. This was a matter for older justice. So you used Armand's genealogical research to identify the descendants of Marclaire's persecutors. Miss Ashworth said, her scholarly mind piecing together the conspiracy you arranged this weekend, gathering to eliminate them all. Exactamo, Pooh confirmed. But Armand discovered the truth about his butler's identity when he found the seventh key, the one that bore not a guest's name, but the true name of Henri Delacroix. He confronted Dubois and paid for that knowledge with his life. The broken key. I realized Delacroix was trying to reveal the killer's identity even as he died. Indeed, Hastings. But our killer had prepared for such a contingency. The elaborate revenge scheme provided the perfect cover for what was essentially a crime of greed, the elimination of the Delacroix line, so that the true heir could claim his inheritance. Dubois straightened his servant's disguise, falling away entirely. Mary Claire's blood flows in my veins, her property, her chateau, her fortune, all of it belongs to me by right of birth. The others were obstacles to remove. Nothing more, but you made one fatal error. Poirot continued. Relentlessly, you assumed that justice delayed was justice denied in your obsession with the wrongs of the past. You failed to consider that present justice would eventually find you. Inspector Beaumont rose from his chair, his professional demeanor reasserting itself. Henri Dubois, I arrest you for the murders of Armand Delacroix, Evangeline Moreau, Henri Dufresne, Victor, Lamartine and Philippe Renard, as the handcuffs clicked into place around the butler's wrists. He looked up at Marie Claire's portrait with an expression of twisted devotion. "She has her justice at last," he whispered. "The bloodline of her enemies is ended, and her true heir claims what was always rightfully his." "No," Poirot said quietly. "Marie Claire has no justice in these murders. She was a victim of greed and conspiracy, yes, but she was also a woman of faith and compassion. She would not have wanted her descendant to become a killer in her name." The dawn was breaking over Ebon Court as Inspector Beaumont led his prisoner away. The long nightmare finally ended. The bridge to the mainland had been repaired during the night, and soon we would leave this place of ancient secrets and modern crimes. As I packed my belongings, I found Poirot standing once more before Marie Claire's portrait, his expression thoughtful and melancholy. "A tragedy," he said softly. "The sins of the past poisoning the present generation after generation hungry." Dubois believed, was serving justice, but he served only his own twisted desires for revenge and wealth. The morning sun streamed through the portrait gallery's window, illuminating Marie Claire's painted face with golden light. For a moment, I could almost imagine that her expression had softened, as if some ancient burden had finally been lifted from her spirit. Justice, it seemed, had many faces, and not all of them were as righteous as they appeared. The 7 keys of Ebon Court had unlocked not divine retribution, but the darkest chambers of the human heart, where greed and hatred could masquerade as righteousness. For centuries, waiting only for the right moment to claim their terrible price. Thanks for joining us for the 7 keys of Ebon Court. Did you suspect? The butler Henri Dubois, before Poirot revealed his true identity as Marie Claire's descendant. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this adventure with Hercule Poirot, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, remember Poirot's wisdom. The truth lies not always in the obvious clues, but in the careful observation of human nature, where greed and revenge can masquerade as justice for centuries.